Okay, the next item of business is a debate on motion 15735 in the name of CoCab Stewart on empowering young people's voices in tackling violence against women and girls. I'd invite members wishing to participate to press the request to speak buttons now or as soon as possible, and I call on CoCab Stewart to speak to and move the motion. Minister, around 9 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am proud to open our debate, marking the annual 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence campaign, calling for everyone to imagine a Scotland that is free from violence against women and girls. Last year, Zero Tolerance worked with a group of women who were asked to imagine just that. The film they created was full of words like respected and free. They thought that Scotland would be busy because so many more women and girls would be in public spaces, laughing, talking and having fun. Sadly, as 2024 draws to a close, violence, abuse and misogyny remain an everyday and detrimental reality for women and girls in Scotland, and indeed internationally. I am proud of our contribution to tackling this global issue and pleased to announce today the launch of the new phase of our Police Scotland Partnership programme with the police services of Malawi and Zambia. This new programme, through our International Development Fund, will continue to tackle violence against women and children. And whilst we have our differences across this chamber, I'm sure that we can all be unanimous in recognising the importance of the global 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence. And that violence against women and girls has no place in Scotland. As Taylor Swift sung in her song Starlight, don't dream impossible things. A Scotland without violence against women is not an impossible thing, but it is a bold goal and ambitious. As parliamentarians, we can demonstrate through our collective voice that we are united in our ambition to end this blight on our society. A significant message from the Scottish Youth Parliament's recent debate was the importance of respectful dialogue and to recognise that young people's voices are an integral part of the movement tackling this issue. I want to welcome members of the Scottish Youth Parliament who are present in the chamber today, and I also want to thank them for so eloquently voicing the concerns of young people on this topic during their debate. As I promised them, we have to use their debate to inform the motion for today, emphasising the importance of meaningful engagement with children and young people. The Scottish Government has a bold ambition to make Scotland the best place in the world to grow up. An Act fully commenced in July 2024, which incorporated in Scots law the rights and obligations set out in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child within the limits of our devolved competence. The right for children to have their views heard and taken seriously is a guiding general principle of the UNCRC, and we are committed to ensuring that children and young people are at the heart of the decisions that affect them. It is why the member of the Scottish Youth Parliament, Olivia Brown, has a representative voice on the Equally Safe Joint Strategic Board, which oversees and supports the work to tackle violence against women and girls through our Equally Safe Delivery Plan. The issues raised in the Youth Parliament debate, including technological facilitated abuse, are reflected in many of the deliverables in the plan. Online abuse is a key issue affecting young people today, and we recognise the harm and distress that this causes to those who are targeted. I saw for myself on a recent visit to Glasgow and Clyde Rape Crisis Centre, where young people had been supported to develop an awareness-raising exhibition which focused on mainstream and social media handling of violence against women. Keeping children and young people in Scotland safe from online harm is a priority for the Scottish Government, and while the regulation of the internet is reserved, we will continue to engage with the UK Government and Ofcom on the implementation of its Online Safety Act and ensure there are improved protections to keep children safe online. I want us to lead from the front, and that is why our Equally Safe Delivery Plan has a commitment that I convene a media summit to bring key players from across all forms of media, including social media, to formulate a progressive and united approach to challenging violence and abuse. Furthermore, in collaboration with Education Scotland, we have ensured that digital literacy, including internet safety and cyber resilience, is an integral part of the school curriculum. The Parent Club website also provides information and advice to parents on how to keep children safe online. On the 18th of November, the Minister for Victims and Community Safety attended the launch of a sextortion campaign. It was launched to respond to a growing incidence of sextortion over the last 12 months in Scotland. The campaign was a collaboration between Fearless Crime Stoppers, Police Scotland and the Scottish Government. Importantly, it's been co-designed with teenagers, the group most affected by this issue. The collaborative model is one that I am keen to see replicated in other areas of our work. In recognition of the prevalence of harmful sexual behaviour for young people, we continue to implement Equally Safe in Schools. Developed by Zero Tolerance and Rape Crisis Scotland, the project works to prevent gender-based violence and increase confidence and skills in order to respond accordingly. I will take an intervention.
Tess White.
Minister, does the Scottish Government and the Minister believe that the best way, or one of the best ways of improving the situation with violence against women and girls is through education and educating young people?
Minister, I'll give you the time back.
I do agree, and I'm glad that the member agrees and has given me the opportunity to re-emphasise my point and celebrate the work of Education Scotland and our teachers up and down the country in that work of important education. Our Mentors in Violence Prevention Scotland programme addresses gender stereotyping and harmful attitudes that condone violence against women and girls. Additionally, the Gender Equality and Task Force in Education and Learning focuses on eradicating systemic gender equality in education. I wish to pay tribute to the role that the sector has played in supporting women, children and young people who have experienced violence, abuse and exploitation. I witnessed first-hand on a visit to Monklands Women's Aid at the start of the 16 days that their work saves and transforms lives. And I am fully aware that these are challenging times for the sector and the services are under enormous strain. I want the sector to know that I am committed to continuing this government's support for the vital work they do. And that is why, Presiding Officer, I am pleased that earlier today I was able to confirm my commitment to the DES Fund and advise current recipients of our intention to extend the fund until March 2026. Finally, I want this Parliament not just to imagine a better future for women and girls, but to be the driving force for change and the elimination of violence against women and girls. And I move the motion.
Thank you, Minister. Now calling Tess White, around 6 minutes. Miss White.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As we mark the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence campaign, the scourge of violence against women and girls continues to stain society here in Scotland, in the UK and across the world. The figures are spine-chilling. In Scotland last year, 1,721 young women and girls aged 18 or under reported domestic abuse. 405 girls in Scotland under the age of 16 reported rape or attempted rape. Up to 90% of women and girls with learning disabilities have been sexually abused. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. It's an outrage, Presiding Officer. It's utterly shameful and it must end. But public outcry isn't enough. The criminal justice system has a vital role to play in tackling this violence, but as Fiona Mackenzie from the We Can't Consent to This campaign has emphasised, we can't prosecute our way out of this crisis. We must tackle the root causes as well as the conviction rate. Karen Ingala-Smith, who spearheaded the Counting Dead Women campaign, argues in her book Defending Women's Spaces that men's violence against women is more than a number of individual acts perpetrated by individual men. It is a social and a political issue. And she's right, of course. This is about sex inequality and challenging attitudes and behaviours that enable men's violence against women. It is about power and it is about control. Misogyny has loomed large over the lives of women and girls since the dawn of time, but in the era of TikTok and toxic influencers like Andrew Tate, misogyny has become radicalised and amplified. Pornography, freely available and readily accessible, glorifies the objectification and subjugation of women. It has become mainstream online entertainment and it normalises sexual violence. All of this has further devalued and commoditised women and girls, and our focus must be on challenging and dismantling these attitudes. Last week, I lodged a motion in the Scottish Parliament paying tribute to Giselle Pellico, which I'm pleased has received cross-party support. The words of this remarkable woman, "It's not for us to have shame, it's for them." And it resonated loudly throughout the world. But where are the men? That question was posed at an event I co-sponsored with Claire Baker last night, hosted by Byra's Place. It discussed the dangerous and destructive practice of non-fatal strangulation. With the exception of Russell Finlay, it was a room full of women. It was exactly the same at Pam Gosal's event with 4 women the day before, which touched on the prevalence of pornography in schools. This, Presiding Officer, is not about middle-class women of a certain age, although I do fall into that category. It is about women and girls of every age and every imaginable demography. It is about beliefs, attitudes and actions of men, and how can these ever change if men in positions of influence don't show up? Presiding Officer, I do agree with the Scottish Government that education is key. There's a lot that Police Scotland has got wrong when it comes to women, but the Don't Be That Guy campaign was powerful. It challenged the behaviour of men, not women, who for too long have been forced to modify what they wear and what they do to protect their safety. This kind of messaging must be repeated and reinforced as much as possible if it is successfully to unpick the impact of misogyny and pornography. Presiding Officer, earlier this week, Reem Al-Salim, the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls, described the onslaught on women-specific language as a new form of violence against women. And today, this is a consensual debate, but it is a debate that is taking place just days after the Supreme Court met to decide what counts as a woman. That ambiguity was created by the SNP government, and if our own government cannot define a woman, how can it plausibly secure our safety? When vulnerable women and girls cannot rely on single-sex spaces to support them after experiencing violence and sexual abuse because of that ambiguity, where do they turn? Where do they go? When a member of the Scottish Parliament is wrongly accused of being transphobic for standing up for women's rights, as I was yesterday by Patrick Harvey, what signal does that kind of bullying send not just to women and girls, but to men and boys? It's shameful. Presiding Officer, will I get the time back?
You will get
Thank
the time
you.
back. Yeah, Minister.
Would the member accept that under the Equality Act, single-sex spaces are absolutely a right?
Tess White.
I'm glad the Minister has said that, and I'd like the Minister to share that with her colleagues and make sure that that is enshrined, and actually does say to the KC who represented, Presiding Officer, the KC who represented, who needed a flow diagram to describe this. I think the Minister should have a conversation with her very own government KC. Presiding Officer, today's debate is an opportunity to take stock, to call for greater accountability and to demand renewed action. Violence against women and girls can and must be prevented, but to get there, this government and this Parliament must look inwards as well as outwards. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Katie Clark. Around 5 minutes, Ms Clark.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank the Minister for bringing this motion to the Chamber as we mark 16 days of activism and for the cross-party nature of this debate. 16 days of activism developed from the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, which we mark on 25th November. It was established in 1981 by Latin American and Caribbean feminists and then adopted by the UN. Despite the 16 days of activism having been marked since 1999, we all know that there still remains a huge amount to be done. So I welcome the focus of this motion, which highlights the importance of education and listening to younger people and how we can address women's inequality. 93% of young people recently consulted by the Scottish Youth Parliament agreed that many girls and women feel unsafe in public spaces. We know that violence against women is endemic across the world, and I welcome what the Minister has said about the Scottish Government's international work. But we also know, as the Minister also said, that we have very high levels of violence against women and girls in Scotland. As Tess White says, this is an outrage. The only way this will change is if we change our culture, and young people need to be central to that. In 2021, my colleague Polly McNeill and myself launched Scottish Labour's consultation on ending violence against women and girls to develop our own policies in this area. And one of the key issues which emerged during that consultation was the significant challenge of sexism and misogyny in schools and the need for a cross-campus strategy to deal with sexism and misogyny, and indeed the rising levels of violence against both pupils and staff in schools, particularly girls and women staff. And I want to thank Pam Duncan-Glancy for her support and for the work she is doing on tackling sexism and misogyny in schools and in developing our own policies. And to everyone, all of the young people who have attended events and contributed to the discussion that my party is having, particularly the young people who have been contributing to that discussion. And we all need to support the initiatives that are taking place now to combat sexism in schools, such as the mentoring projects and the variety of initiatives that are taking place across Scotland. But I think we also need to be very clear that what we are currently doing is inadequate and far more needs to be done. We have been joined this week in Parliament by Scottish Women's Aid, who have a stall at Garden Lobby. And they have been sharing with MSPs the experiences of not only the women who use their services, but also the importance of listening to children and young people who are affected by abuse. Women may be able to separate from their abusers, but the abuse can continue through child contact. And again, we need to listen to women and children as we develop our policies in all areas. Research from Engenda shows that 43% of girls and women in Scotland don't feel safe outside alone. The Scottish Government's own research, published last year, found that women felt more comfortable if station ticket offices were open and staffed. but the recent announcement of reduction in hours that has been introduced at ScotRail ticket offices across Scotland is therefore disappointing and another example of how we need to prioritise the needs of girls and women in all of our policies. So I'm looking forward to working alongside my colleague Claire Baker, who's been appointed as Labour's new transport spokesperson, but also to colleagues across the chamber from any party who have a desire to assist in rolling back cuts in ticket offices, but also ensuring safe staffing levels in all public spaces where people need to use public transport. The voice of children and young people is vitally important in all areas of policy, and as MSPs, and indeed the Scottish Government, must ensure that the youth voice is central to action to address gender violence, as this motion sets out. I very much hope that we're able to continue to work on a cross-party basis to ensure this happens, and also that we accept sometimes that is going to have to mean changes in the way that we do politics and the policies that we adopt. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Clark. I now call Maggie Chapman. Around 4 minutes. Ms Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I refer colleagues to my register of interests. Prior to my election, I worked for a rape crisis centre. It is so important that we, during the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, take time to consider what we are and what we are not doing to tackle the everyday sexism, violence and misogyny that women and girls across the world face. And this debate is an opportunity to highlight the excellent work done by so many across Scotland. One of the highlights of this year for me came in February when Monica Lennon and I co-hosted an event to celebrate the expansion of the Young Women Know programme from Tayside to the rest of Scotland. We were delighted to meet many of the young women involved in the programme, to hear their stories and to share their vision and enthusiasm. Young Women Know is a campaign about healthy relationships and consent, led by young women and girls. It began with 3 local projects, including Ua Fierce Girls in Dundee and Brave Lassies Blever in Angus. Ua Fierce Girls, launched in 2021, is a joint project between the Young Women's Movement Scotland, now, as we know, doing excellent work across the country, and Dundee City Council. It works by bringing together young women and girls to develop creative and relevant resources, including animations, to address peer sexual abuse. The campaign aims to make sure that every young woman and girl in Dundee knows what a healthy relationship is and where to go if they need advice or support. As a founding member of the group said, and I quote, "Conversations around healthy relationships and creating a safe space are absolutely crucial. We owe it to the young people in our lives to help them understand how they deserve to be treated and to provide them with a safe space to talk about their relationships, to address peer sexual abuse comfortably and without stigma." Brave Lassies Blever is a partnership programme between the Young Women's Movement and NSPCC Scotland, delivered with Angus Council. It works with young women aged 16 to 18, creating toolkits to support young people in their understanding of healthy relationships, consent and safe spaces. Their messages include, and again I quote, "We want young women to feel like they have a safe place to talk about issues they are having, that their experiences are not what will define them, that there is always someone to speak to, and that they don't have to struggle alone. Women's voices matter. What we have to say matters." I'm sure that many members hearing those words will feel the same bittersweet ache. It is moving that young women have the wisdom and compassion to share that assurance with one another, but it's desperately sad that it is still needed. Women's voices do matter. The North East of Scotland has a rich tradition of women's writing, art, politics and activism, speaking, sharing and making space for women to be heard. I can mention only a few this afternoon, but I pay tribute to all those groups and individuals who have spoken, organised and marched for our safety, our dignity, our autonomy and our liberation. The Aberdeen Women's Alliance was the key organiser of the Aberdeen Reclaim the Night, which took place on Monday, 25th of November. The Women's Rape and Sexual Abuse Centre, Dundee and Angus, and the Dundee Violence Against Women Partnership organised Dundee's Reclaim the Night March on Friday the 29th of November. And the 16 days of activism in Dundee end with an event at Abertay University next Tuesday. Together we stand, a creative call for change. In concluding, Presiding Officer, I echo those words. Together we have to stand, determined to make that change. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. And I now call Beatrice Wishart. Around 4 minutes. Ms Wishart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to make a contribution on behalf of Scottish Liberal Democrats to the annual International 16 Days of Activism debate. And I thank the many organisations that provided briefings for this debate for their contributions and work to address gender inequality and gender-based violence. As others have highlighted, the Scottish Youth Parliament called for various actions to tackle gender-based violence, including early intervention through education and increased support for victims of violence and abuse. Girls are not safe from harassment and abuse in Scotland's schools. A University of Glasgow study found 2/3 of Scottish secondary school pupils had been sexually harassed, with a third experiencing personally invasive behaviour, such as sexual touching. Primary prevention approaches aim to stop this violence by tackling the root cause, which is gender equality. Harassment, verbal abuse and toxic banter must be challenged to disrupt a climate that enables more serious abuse and violence. Gender-based violence affects every community. For her social science baccalaureate, Shetlander Gracie Gowans-Little conducted a survey into perceptions of sexual violence. 90% of respondents agreed with the statement that sexual violence is an issue in Shetland. At the cross-party group on men's violence against women and girls, a presentation from Angus Women's Aid and Limitless focused on the serious issue of domestic abuse and coercive control in youth relationships. The presenter pointed to the availability of hardcore pornography, creating a situation where high levels of violence are the norm. A report by the Children's Commissioner for England and Wales found that the average age at which children first see pornography is 13 years old, and they were most likely to have seen it on social media sites. Research shows exposure to this content, which often depicts violence towards women, creates attitudes that are permissive towards coercion and aggression in sexual interactions. These concerning findings demonstrate the importance of dedicated education for young people, covering healthy relationships, consent, and critical literacy. Young men and boys also need critical thinking skills to tackle the reach of so-called misogynistic influencers. Boys looking for videos on topics such as cars or exercise are at risk of exposure to their content, which draws them in with videos about making money and motivational advice, escalating to misogynistic rants and hateful comments. Misogynistic attitudes are linked to the perpetration of violence against women and to higher rates of substance abuse and depression amongst men. Teenagers are drawn to risk and rebellion, meaning it's not just enough to say to that influencers are wrong. Emily Setter, a researcher in criminology, argues that we must understand why young men and boys are vulnerable to these messages and offer them a credible alternative. I commend the work of Rape Crisis Scotland and the University of Glasgow in developing Equally Safe at School, a toolkit to create a whole school approach to preventing gender-based violence in secondary schools. I hope we will see schools across Scotland equipped to tackle the harmful cultures in schools to prevent gender-based violence and support children affected by it. Teachers will need support for training and enacting new policies too. Education can help normalise men challenging each other's behaviours. As others have said, the That Guy campaign from Police Scotland encourages men to have frank conversations with each other about behaviour that's damaging to women and prevent harassment. Finally, I would like to mention last year's debate when I spoke of the patriarchy and misogyny restricting women and girls' freedoms in Afghanistan. The situation is even worse today. In August, the Taliban prohibited women's voices from being heard in public. The level of human rights violations is so extensive that Amnesty International's latest report found it constitutes gender persecution. I do have more to say, but realise I'm running out of time. So thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Wishart. We now move to the open debate. I call first Claire Haughey, to be followed by Pam Gosal. Around 4 minutes. Ms Haughey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Violence against women and girls is a blight in our society, which is a consequence of gender inequality and the misogyny that permeates all our lives. And I would like to begin by thanking Zero Tolerance Scotland for sharing some research ahead of this debate, as well as for the work which they do year-round. Zero Tolerance says girls and young women today are facing a daily assault of misogyny, while boys and young men face the pressure of unhealthy masculinity. They warn that extreme misogyny is resurging, with attitudes that seek to justify and incite violence finding a home on the internet. Online communities and so-called influencers create content targeted specifically towards boys and young men, peddling extreme misogynist views, which can then creep into other online and offline discourse. Last year, 83% of senior secondary school teachers said that they are worried these attitudes and beliefs are having a direct and negative impact on pupils' behaviour. This is obviously extremely concerning. Presiding Officer, the World Association of Girl Guides and Girl Scouts have a global flagship campaign to end violence against girls and women, for which they should be commended. And during a recent visit to the county of West Lanarkshire Girl Guides annual review, which covers part of my Rutherglen constituency, I was honoured to become a Girl Guiding Ambassador, a role which encompasses recognising the value of what Girl Guiding does and promoting the opportunities they give to girls and young women. Each year, Girl Guides and Girl Scouts around the world play their part in tackling violence against women and girls in their communities through advocacy, education, awareness raising, community action and research. And at home, Girl Guiding produces an annual Girls' Attitude Survey. Now in its 16th year, the survey gives girls and young women a platform to speak out about the things that matter to them and, importantly, ask about the challenges they face as girls and young women today. This year, they also produced a manifesto for all girls ahead of the general election. And some of the statistics from this work are sobering. Compared to 10 years ago, today twice as many girls report feeling unsafe due to sexism. 69% of girls say they hear toxic comments about women and girls at school. 44% say they've heard comments at school that have made them feel scared for their safety. As they concluded, with the rise of sexism, online misogyny and gender-based violence, girls often don't feel safe. The refreshed Equally Safe strategy, launched earlier this year, states that by challenging the misogyny and harmful attitudes which these young people are reporting, we can pave the way for the effective dismantling of the gender-based structures and attitudes which enable and support violence against women and girls. Research shows us that education is a critical component in changing societal attitudes and reducing abuse, covering issues such as consent, healthy relationships, understanding signs of abusive behaviour and challenging gender stereotypes from an early age. The latest Delivering Equally Safe Fund Impact report shows that the number of young people accessing sessions via grassroots organisations is increasing, which is to be welcomed. However, Presiding Officer, it can still feel like as a society we have a very long way to go. There is no doubt this is challenging work. Misogyny must be challenged. Aggression and violence against women and girls is unacceptable. And we must all add our support and efforts to ensuring an equally safe place for all women and girls. It's absolutely crucial to achieve our shared aim that we have a Scotland without violence in any of its forms against women and girls.
Thank you, Ms Haughey. I now call Pam Gosal to be followed by Elena Whittam. Around 4 minutes, Ms Gosal.
Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Before I begin, I would like to thank all the organisations for providing briefings today for this debate and the hard work they do. I would also like to thank For Women Scotland for working with me to sponsor a roundtable this week, highlighting violence and sexual harassment in the workplace, which is an area that I hope the Government takes serious and does more work on. Every year, the Parliament holds a debate on the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, and this is the fourth year in a row I have contributed to this debate. Every year, MSPs stand in this chamber, mention statistics, personal experiences, case studies, and ask what more can be done. It's very sad, however, that not much has changed even today. Violence against women and girls and domestic abuse is something I personally take very seriously. From a young age, I remember my mother helping distressed women, sometimes in tears, bruised and even bleeding, in her shop in Argyll Street. As I was young, I didn't know much at that time. Only years later did I learn that these women were suffering from domestic abuse and violence. My political role gave me the opportunity now to take a stance on this. This year's theme for the 16 days of activism is towards Beijing Plus 30 Unite to End Violence Against Women and Girls, referring to the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and the Platform for Action. These 16 days are not just days, but rather a lifetime for people. According to the United Nations, 1 in 3 experience violence in their lifetime. That includes 1 in 4 adolescent girls who are abused by their partners. Most tragically, every 18 minutes a woman is killed by her partner or by a family member, with 60% of femicides committed by partners or family members. To put that in context, just imagine, from the beginning to the end of this 80-minute debate, 8 women will have tragically lost their lives. These are real lives, and these statistics are absolutely unacceptable. Moving closer to home, shockingly, every 10 minutes an incident of domestic abuse is reported to Police Scotland. Recent figures have shown that for the fiscal year 23 and 24, the number of domestic abuse incidents reported to Police Scotland have risen almost by 64,000. Risen to almost 64,000. The number of reoffenders have also risen, with an estimated 65% of reported cases. At the same time, statistics have also shown that the number of recorded sexual crimes and domestic abuse incidents have increased by 10% and 25% respectively. Unfortunately, the real figures are much worse, as many survivors are afraid of reporting these crimes to the police. Will I get the time back?
Audrey Nicholl.
I thank the member for giving way. I'm just wondering if I appreciate everything that she has pointed out, but I just wonder if she would welcome the fact that yesterday's budget included an announcement of £26 million to specifically to support victims of crime, and obviously a significant number of those victims would be victims in respect of violence against women. And also, is she aware that the Criminal Justice Committee is currently scrutinising the Victims and Witnesses Justice Reform Bill?
Pam Gosal, I give you the time.
Thank you. I thank the member for that response. Absolutely, every penny we need, looking after the fact that not just domestic abuse, sexual violence, but we need to make sure those streets are safe so that our women and girls can go out there. I absolutely welcome it, but I think we have a lot more to do in here, not just to hand out money. There's behaviours, as you'll hear as well, we need to change as well. As today's debate is about empowering young people's voices, we must highlight the prevalence of violence among young people. One organisation I spoke to, which helps survivors of domestic abuse, indicated that they are witnessing a stark increase in the number of young people seeking support. Many times, the perpetrator is also under the age of 18. Coercive behaviour is also a form of abuse and is being increasingly reported to in further and higher education. Recently, I attended a BBC lecture on violence by Dr Gwen Adshed, who said, "If schools are not emotional education, then I'm not quite sure what they are for." That is why my Protection of Domestic Abuse Scotland Bill is very important, as it provides a statutory requirement and received overwhelming support, with 94% of consultation respondents agreeing to it. In closing, Presiding Officer, I would like to conclude this debate with some personal thoughts. Why is it that when our daughters leave our home, and I know, coming from an Asian family, that our parents say to us that be safe, text us, phone us when you get there. Should your dad pick you up? Should your brother pick you up? Are you going to get home safe? When will it be that parents or mothers even say to their sons, see, when you're out there, just be careful, son, that you don't make any female feel uncomfortable and that you respect women? What a change that would make, and if we change those behaviours with boys and men, that we wouldn't today be standing here. And I'm hoping next year that we can report on something that has been done and changes have been made in men's behaviour. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I now call Eleanor Whittam to be followed by Callum Walker in around 4 minutes. Ms Whittam.
Presiding Officer, like many feminists of a certain age, I'm tired of fighting a system that is so ingrained with inequality that it feels immovable, intransigent, like the glass ceiling is becoming ever more opaque and could soon become the cement ceiling, meaning smashing the patriarchy is that much harder, a task so difficult it feels impossible, and which can make the yearly 16 Days campaign feel futile. And then I hear the voices of our young women. My 16-year-old daughter and thousands like her who raise their fists and their voices, shouting from the rooftops that what is happening today is not okay, because, Presiding Officer, today it's worse than ever. Our young men are being captured by a pervasive culture of misogynistic hatred, dressed up as the greatest of all-time influencers who peddle a brand of toxic masculinity so damaging, so all-encompassing, that I see clearly we have gone back in time to an age where women and young girls are subjected openly to hate on a daily basis in all spheres of their lives. We need to ask ourselves, how did we get here? How did we empower the likes of Andrew Tate to poison the discourse so insidiously that he has not only taken too many young men with him, he has also succeeded in helping to convince too many young women that feminism and the quest for real equality is damaging to society? How is it that we have left social media unbridled to the extent that you only are a click away from encountering extreme violent pornography that glorifies and normalises strangulation, meaning our young people are at risk of becoming desensitised to what is a normal, healthy relationship? Many years ago, as a teenager, I railed against the use of women's bodies to sell products due to the damage it did to women as a whole. Today, the internet age we live in is dominated by influencers and those who seek to make money in any way possible, meaning that my teenage plight seems tame in comparison to the horrors that our young folk navigate day in and day out. And I'll take the intervention.
Rachel Hamilton.
I thank Eleanor Whittam for taking the intervention. And I know that she wasn't able to make the event at Byres Place, sponsored by Claire Baker and Tess White. But Scotland is the only country in the UK that is yet to introduce specific legislation to address non-fatal strangulation. They've done it in England and Wales. They've done it in Ireland, and I think it is about time that we persuade our Scottish Government to look at a specific legislation rather than relying on assault as the crime.
Eleanor Whittam, I can give you the time back.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with the member, and it's something that I have been looking at for a very long time. And before coming in this place, I led work in East Ayrshire in the Violence Against Women's Partnership, looking at the pervasiveness and the horribleness of pornography and what it is doing to our young people and our population as a whole. When talking about these issues, we also cannot shy away from the fact that so many of our young men feel ostracised and left behind. A feeling that is nurtured and exploited by incels and those on the far right. And we need to unpack this reality and address it urgently. We owe it to those boys and to their life chances. Why are we failing them as well? But, Presiding Officer, we must also confront the fact that increasing numbers of young women do not feel able to participate fully in their own lives. twice as many as a decade ago. They feel scared to travel in public transportation, to walk the school or college corridors, to speak out in class, to venture out to the local shops. Young Scots are crying out for a different world, and we have a responsibility to help them create it. We know that extreme misogyny is a symptom of the wider patriarchal attitudes and rigid gender norms that still permeate our society. And to eradicate misogyny and men's violence against women, we must tackle the gender inequality that is at its core. And we can do this through effective primary prevention and the Equally Safe strategy. Focusing on structural, cultural, attitudinal and behavioural change. This is the long-term holistic strategy with the aim of ensuring that all women and girls, especially marginalised women, share equal power with men and boys. But we must forensically look at all the parts of the system and root out those parts that work against the aims of our Equally Safe strategy and address them urgently. And we must make the misogyny bill a reality. And finally, Presiding Officer, as a former women's aid worker who has seen firsthand the harrowing reality of how court-mandated, forced, unsafe contact perpetuates abuse on child survivors of domestic abuse, I say loudly that we cannot ignore their voices. Voices that have now been amplified by their rights under the UNCRC. Our court system must pay due regard to their right to feel safe and free from further abuse by an abuser who will all too often use the system as a form of lawfare and coercive control. And I urge all of you to participate in the social media vigil #ForThemAll this Friday at 7 p.m. to remember the far too many women and children who have been murdered by their abusers. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Whittam. I now call Carol Mochan to be followed by Ben McPherson. Around 4 minutes, Ms Mochan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the chance to speak in this debate and contribute to what is a sobering discussion about what more can be done to protect and empower young people's voices in Scotland. While the theme of this year's activism is to imagine a Scotland without gender-based violence, recent statistics remind us that violence against women and girls remains far too common. Presiding Officer, I attended a meeting last night, as others have mentioned, hosted by Tess White and Claire Baker, and the meeting brought to this Parliament the stark reality of the situation in Scotland. It touched on the unpleasant truth about life for many women and girls, particularly those most vulnerable in our society. If, for example, we look at domestic abuse, a clear majority of domestic abuse victims are women, and the vast majority of perpetrators are men. And we must not shy away from that reality. Women do not fear being attacked or abused by other women. They fear the actions of men, and therefore we must focus on the behaviour of men, as been said, if we wish to put an end to this. In 23-24, there were more than 63,000 recorded incidents of domestic abuse in Scotland, and that's a 3% increase from the previous year. The recorded incidents of rape and attempted rape increased by 10%, with 95% of victims being women. And the reality for our young women of the sexual crimes reported in 23-24, 37% involved a victim under the age of 18 years old. These are just a few of the damning insights into gender-based violence in Scotland. But it does not have to be like this. Gender violence is not innate. The truth is, it is learned and nurtured through stereotypes, misogyny, bias and ingrained inequalities. Now, I also want to raise the issue of pornography and the normalisation of porn in the lives of young men. Last night, we heard from women researching this area, one which is not often tackled as it is uncomfortable and perhaps seems impossible to change. But porn is not acceptable, it is not normal, and we should be saying this to young men. Young men need to know, and they need to be educated on the the kindness that relationships can bring, and not on these behaviours that are played out in these pornographic images. Society has a responsibility to challenge this industry and the behaviours that relate to it. And we, as parliamentarians, must ensure adequate but also appropriate resources are provided to tackle this injustice. And I do welcome much of what the Minister has contributed in her opening speech and the work of the Government. But I also think that members across the Chamber have made some very powerful statements about what we can do. The recent statistics we all agree reveal more must be done to tackle violence against women and girls. And can I thank Beatrice Wishart for bringing up the issue of Afghanistan. We all, I think, would agree that what is happening for women and young girls in Afghanistan must be challenged. Scotland should never accept complacency. It must challenge all aspects of violence against women, both here in Scotland and, as Beatrice Wishart reminded us, right across the world. A Scottish Labour report, as we've heard, produced last year found a significant shift in social and cultural norms is required in order to prevent and address violence against women and girls. Tackling sexism and misogyny from a young age is critical to ending gender-based violence later down the line. So the Government must ensure it funds initiatives and services which really promote that necessary cultural change. I want to just add before I close, Presiding Officer, that women in politics have always worked cross-party, prepared to work with governments to develop new strategies which should be followed by tangible outcomes. We need men in this chamber and to do this, and I really welcome the First Minister in taking a lead on this today, and I thank him for being here and all the men in the chamber. For young girls and young people, we must tackle these behaviours, and so I hope that we can work cross-party to change this in Scotland. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Mochan. And I call the final speaker in the open debate, Ben McPherson, around 4 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, not so long ago in this chamber, we reflected on the situation in Afghanistan and the terrible and horrific circumstances for women and girls in that country. Denied access to healthcare, denied access to education, repressed and denied their human rights. Afghanistan is a very different place to Scotland, but it is a warning from history, a warning from the present as well, that things can regress. And these 16 days, both here in Scotland and internationally, are a chance for us to remember those who've suffered from violence against women and girls, to reflect on the situation that we're in, and for those of us who are men to refocus on what more we can and should do. In Scotland, we have made significant advancements with legislation, although I appreciate there are calls for more. There is the Government's commitment to bringing forward a law on misogyny. There is collaboration across the UK to take more action in terms of the difficulties in social media and what it's doing in terms of in certain very worrying instances, as has been referenced, almost encouraging toxic masculinity. But also there is the important work here in Scotland that is done by our many stakeholders through funding from the Government and through the Equally Safe strategy. The many projects and organisations that make a difference across the country and in our communities. In Edinburgh, Northern and Leith, we have some very specific focused organisations like Seat San Jog and Shakti Women's Aid and Sahelia. And then there are the national bodies like Women's Aid, who are with us here this week in the Garden Lobby. Aberlour and Financially Included have been doing work in Parliament today, and I was very glad to meet with them earlier about the important work they're doing around reducing coercive control and coerced debt. There is the White Ribbon Scotland organisation, who have engaged with many of us in the Parliament in recent years, and I will be hosting an event with them on persuading men and boys to take action on men's violence against women and girls next week in Parliament, along with Zero Tolerance, who have provided important information for us today and do great work, as others have said. Because there is so much to do. Many statistics have already been stated, but only 19% of girls and women feel completely safe in educational settings, according to Zero Tolerance Scotland. And in relation to misogyny and gendered attitudes in schools, they've also found out through their research that 83% of school teachers are worried about the influence of online personalities and the negative effect they're having on young boys and their behaviour. And indeed, if we look back at research from even 10 years ago, young people's attitudes to violence in women and girls, the report that was done in 2016, based on the Young People in Scotland survey 2014, showed worrying trends even back then. So we've really got to get ahead of the prevention work and invest in prevention, and that's what all these organisations are asking us to do. So that means initiative, that means hard cash for these third sector organisations that make such a difference, sometimes an intangible difference, but also it means leadership from all of us as role models, as parliamentarians, as community leaders. Last year I put forward 16 actions that members of the Scottish Parliament could take over the course of the year between each of these 16 days of activism. And again, I would encourage colleagues to meet those 16 actions, particularly male colleagues, because I think that's one of the key points that we can make a difference in terms of being in our communities, being proactive, and not just engaging in "don't be that guy," as great a campaign as that is, but also saying, here's how you can be a good guy, here's how you can be a better guy. We're not all perfect, and we can, all young people and individuals can make a difference. And I would just say, with regard to young people, here and more widely, we are in a struggle for influencing young men's views and behaviour and how they are formed and shaped. So the more that men can do to encourage healthy masculinity, be active in our communities and online, the bigger difference we can make and try and improve this situation before the next 16 days of activism.
Thank you very much. We now move to the closing speeches. I call first Maggie Chapman. Up to 4 minutes. Ms Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I spoke earlier about Our Fierce Girls in Dundee and Brave Lassies Blever in Angus, making a huge difference to the lives of young people. Again, I thank and applaud them. But I also wonder, what more would they be able to do if they didn't have to put those energies, that creativity, into the basic foundational work of enabling decent, non-toxic relationships? What transformations could all that solidarity and care achieve if it didn't have to resist the ever-increasing violence that women and girls are facing? Zero Tolerance found that fewer than a fifth of girls and young women feel completely safe in educational settings, that the number feeling unsafe has doubled in the past 10 years, that they are silenced in class, losing sleep and concentration through fear of violence, harassment and rape. How did we get here after decades of activism, political change, public education, awareness campaigns? Again, the Zero Tolerance briefing gives us some clues. They found that boys and young men are absorbing deeply misogynistic material without any awareness that this is not normal. The language of the incel movement, Andrew Tate as a role model. These are no longer confined to a troubled niche. They are, for a growing number of young men, the mainstream, the norm. The effects of this deep poison are deep and broad. They hang a heavy cloud over the lives of girls and young women. At risk and as risk and perception of risk, everyday misogyny, hostility and insult, anxiety and fear affect almost all, with worse for many. They stifle the development of boys and young men, exploiting their emotions with predatory role models, insidious narratives and toxic tales of patriarchy. They oppress, insult and undermine young people who resist binary heteronormative gender roles, and they undermine healthy relationships for all young people. This isn't something that we can shrug off as a passing craze. The normalization of deep, extreme misogyny, the othering of anyone outside of the self-imposed identity, the toxic concept of the alpha or high-value male, and the increasing gulf between young women and young men in their experiences, attitudes and values are all profound dangers to both individual and community well-being. For the attitudes and behaviours of radicalised adolescents find their reflection in older generations too. Being successful means being able to assault women with impunity. It doesn't take the re-election of Donald Trump to demonstrate that rule. Just look at this week's news in the UK and Ireland. So what can we do? We need primary prevention, education and training, as Zero Tolerance, the Scottish Women's Convention and Close the Gap recommend. We need action on economic and other abuse, as highlighted by Aberlour and Scottish Women's Aid. We need a robust and effective misogyny law. And we need action, urgently, by men as our allies. The boys and young men radicalised by extreme misogyny will not listen to women or girls. We know that. But they may still listen to other men. We need to see more men step up to name misogyny, to call it out, to tell the truth about the harm it causes. We need that to happen now, not only by those whose job it is, not only by those who have a son, a nephew, a grandson or a brother, and not only because they have a sister or a daughter. Because misogyny harms women, yes, but it harms men too, in some ways more deeply. Toxic narratives created this crisis, but honest conversations can help heal it. Conversations about what it truly means to be successful, about living an authentic, compassionate life, a life where women and girls feel safe and respected in your presence. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call on Paul O'Kane. Again, up to 4 minutes. Mr O'Kane.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I'm pleased to be closing on behalf of Scottish Labour in this very important debate. And I will perhaps pick up where other speakers have left off in reflecting the importance of ensuring that boys and men understand the role, the vital role that they have to play in terms of changing our behaviours, reflecting on our behaviours, and not leaving it to women and girls to tackle the scourge of violence, aggression, and all of the issues that we have heard discussed and debated here today. And it is perhaps disappointing that we appear only to have had myself and Ben McPherson speaking in this debate today. And there have been such a range of really inspiring and important speeches, but again, made by women. And we have to reflect that more men must take responsibility in this Parliament and in society for behaviours and for working together. And I think I would just want to, in summing up, reflect on those many contributions that were made today and the many actions that we have to take out of today's debate and move forward with. And we're focusing today within the motion, obviously, on the role of young people. And I think we've heard much today about the really concerning nature of what young people are indeed experiencing. And I think what's important is that we learn from that and we move forward. And I think it's about schools and ensuring that we have really good education. And I think we've heard that from a number of speakers today. And that's education, of course, about young girls and women understanding issues around consent and respect and the support that they can get. But I think, as I said in my opening, crucially, ensuring that boys and young men are educated, that they have positive role models, that they understand the real issues that exist around consent and respect, and that they reflect on their behaviours and that they have a space in order to do that. I think that's something we would all want to take away from the debate today and do more work on. And it's why I'm glad that Katie Clark was able to raise the work that's been done within Scottish Labour on these issues, ensuring that we do have a suite of policies that I think we could look at cross-party. And I know the Minister has referred to the work that's been done by the government, and other parties have spoken about their work so that we can move this forward. Because it is clear that toxic masculinity is on the rise, that we have serious and concerning issues around sexism and misogyny, that we have serious issues around access to really harmful pornography. And I would, of course, recognise the work that's been done across the Parliament to look at many of these issues in depth, to look at better online regulation, to look at that education piece, to look at positive role models. And I think it's important that we continue to work together on those issues. And of course, I would also reflect the work that has been referenced today around strangulation, the event that was held this week. Claire Baker, I know my colleague, involved in that work as well. And I think there really came out of the debate, I think, a consensus that there's more work we can do all together to look at these very serious issues. I was pleased to hear reference to some of the international issues that I think sit across these 16 days, not least the issues in Afghanistan that we know are very serious and we should all take seriously and reflect upon and take action on. So I think it was important that Beatrice Wishart was able to bring that into the debate. I think that we heard powerful contributions in the latter section of the open debate from Pam Gothel, Elena Witham, Carol Malkin and others, reflecting, I think, on the questions that we need to ask ourselves as a society, and indeed the questions that boys and men have to ask ourselves. And I thought Pam Gothel's challenge, actually, to us all about getting to a stage when mothers say to their sons, or fathers say to their sons, who are you going to be when you go out tonight and how are you going to treat women? I think that is vitally important. And I thought Ben McPherson followed that up by saying that it's not enough just to not be that guy, but actually we should all try to be a better person and a good guy and think about our behaviours. So I thought those were two extremely important reflections as well. I am conscious in terms of my comments on the open debate that we could have had more men, but I do want to acknowledge, of course, that the First Minister will make a contribution at the conclusion of the debate, and I do think that is important and that the whole government are taking this seriously. I think it's clear that across the chamber we all have much more work to do. It's not just about 16 days of activism, although they are important. It's about 365 days in the year and ensuring that we take this issue seriously and that, crucially, men and boys take our role seriously to work to change attitudes and behaviours and to ensure that we have respect for women and girls and that we have a more equal society moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr O'Kane. And before the First Minister, I will call Brian Whittle for up to 5 minutes. Mr Whittle.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. And I'm really pleased to rise to close on behalf of the Scottish Conservative and listen to such impassioned speeches from across the chamber and the agreement from across the chamber of what we're trying to tackle here. And I was really pleased to hear CoCab Stewart opening with her comments around the importance of a collective response to this. And if it ever was going to be demonstrated how important this Parliament takes this, it's looking around the chamber and the fact that the First Minister is here to make a speech and the leader of the Scottish Conservatives are here to make a speech. And across this chamber and online, the number of colleagues that think this is important enough to attend on a Thursday afternoon, Deputy Presiding Officer, which, as we all know, is not the norm. We should be proud of that. I want to focus a lot of my comments around prevention strategies, around adults setting examples, as we've heard today from many contributors about adults setting examples to young people and to young boys in particular, because traits like racism and sexism are learned behaviours. It's not enough to recognise misogyny. It is time, as we've been challenged in here, it is time that men challenged it openly to set the standard for our children and their peers. Because casual misogyny exists. And we know that we've made great strides in tackling things like casual racism and casual homophobia. And we have to do the same for misogyny. And it's a timely debate, considering what's happening recently in the press. Am I surprised that misogyny at that level still exists? Absolutely not. However, it's the attitude of the establishment to the reporting of such behaviours, that willingness to allow it to continue unchecked, to sweep it under the carpet, that's the most shocking and repulsive. It just emboldens those who perpetrate that kind of obnoxious behaviour. I think in society, I want to talk about the perception of sexism. That has come a long way, and I make no apologies, Deputy Presiding Officer, for using sport as a reflection of society. I think sport has such a fantastic vehicle to tackle all kinds of inequalities and behaviours such as racism and homophobia and religious bias, because that focus on performance and achievement delivers a mutual respect that transcends any colour, creed, race or religion or sex. However, I would remind the Chamber that it was only in 1984 that women were first allowed to run in the Olympic marathon, which was won by Joan Benoit. And those Olympics, women weren't allowed to run any further than 3,000 metres. They weren't allowed to do the hammer. They weren't allowed to do the pole vault. They weren't allowed to do the triple jump. All things that were put in place by men. But we are actually starting to change the dial. I think attitudes to women are starting to change. And I want to highlight, I found out recently a Caledonian women's gladiators basketball match the only two professional basketball teams in the whole of Scotland, they both get paid exactly the same, while they're trying to raise the number of people watching the women's basketball to reflect the same as the men. And I think so. It can be done, Deputy President, but it can be done. But a word of caution, however, I think Eleanor Whittam put this extremely well. In a recent Girl Guiding Attitude survey in 2024, it highlighted that girls aged 7 to 10 were detailing the way in which girls believe that what they're expected to behave differently because they are girls has actually increased significantly in the last 10 years. Things like the way they look, or the things they like at school, or the games they play, or the things they say, or the books they read. And yes, Presiding Officer, the kind of sport and exercise that they do. So attitudes to women and women in sport have come such a long way in the last 10 years, with women's sport gaining much more kudos and credibility, with all the role models that have shone through. But there are trends that need to be reversed. And this is important, Deputy Presiding Officer. What it demonstrates is that society is undervaluing women and girls, and that pervades and seeps into a young girl's perception of themselves, creating limits for themselves as well as strengthening that inequality and belief in society. STEM subjects are stubbornly male-dominated, and I suspect that is very much related to the perception of the working environment, of those greasy overalls, of the newspaper cuttings that we all know are on the walls, and the way in which women perceive they will be treated in that environment, and we have to work to change that. Girls face sexism and extreme views more commonly in media. Of course, yes.
No, the member is just about to conclude.
Am I? Okay, I'm just about to conclude. Sorry, sorry, but I will. In that case, Deputy Presiding Officer, I will go to my summing up. Then, I think I would like to highlight my colleague Pam Gosel's Prevention of Domestic Abuse Bill, which would create a domestic abuse offenders register that would require those placed on it to report certain changes in their circumstances to the police. That's the kind of message that we need to send from here. It's a very important debate, Deputy Presiding Officer. Actually, one of the most important things we can do is consistently keep this on the agenda. My colleague Tess White, in a very powerful speech, asked the question, where are the men? Well, I am proud that I look around this chamber and online and I see so many men that have turned up for this debate. It's a good start, Deputy Presiding Officer, but there is much more to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Whittle. I now call on the First Minister to wind up the debate. Grateful First Minister, you could take us just up to just before 5 o'clock, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I welcome this opportunity to close the debate on behalf of the Scottish Government. Carol Mochan, Paul O'Kane and Brian Whittle have all made reference to my attendance at this debate as First Minister. Somewhat more bluntly, Tess White said that it was time for the men of influence to show up. And I hope that by my being here, I have perhaps ticked at least one box if Tess White believes I am a man of influence, which might be the most controversial thing that I say this afternoon. The question I ask myself when I hear those comments is, where else should I be at this moment? Because I shouldn't be anywhere else, because it is important that the First Minister of Scotland makes clear the importance that the holder of that office attaches to tackling the issues of violence against women and girls in our society, and to make it abundantly clear that these issues matter at the very heart of government and are taken deadly seriously by the leader of the Scottish Government. We've had this afternoon an incredibly powerful expression of concern that has been shared with Members of Parliament. First of all, by my colleague Elena Whittam, and I can only say that her contribution this afternoon makes me grieve even more for the fact that she will not be in the next Scottish Parliament, which I dearly and deeply regret, because the most powerful comment that Elena Whittam made was the fact of comparing her experience as a teenager with the experience of her teenage daughter now, and how much more difficult it is for teenage girls today than it was when Elena Whittam was growing up. And I am seized by the seriousness of that comment, because it resonates with what the Cabinet heard a couple of weeks ago when we had a meeting, the annual meeting of the Cabinet with children and young people in Scotland. And members of the Children's Parliament the Children's Parliament and members of the Scottish Youth Parliament wanted us to talk about one of our themes about being gender-based violence against women and girls. Members of the Children's Parliament and the Scottish Youth Parliament. If that does not tell us about the gravity and the seriousness of what girls in our society are facing, and women and girls in our society, what else will tell us? My colleague Claire Hawkey made reference to the outstanding work that's been done by Girl Guiding Scotland on the surveying of young girls in our society, and it makes for grim reading of the experiences that girls are having in our society. And Katie Clark, in her comments, made reference to, the widespread concern amongst women about their safety, and all of these contributions from Elena Whittam, Claire Hawkey, from Katie Clark, and crucially from the representatives of the Children's and Young People's Parliament in Scotland, make and stress the importance of Parliament taking these issues seriously. I'll give way to Russell Finlay.
Russell Finlay.
I thank the First Minister for giving way. For a Women's Scotland event in Parliament this week, a female teacher told how male pupils are openly watching porn on their phones, taking upskirt photos of female pupils and subjecting female pupils and staff to depraved sexual comments and intimidation. They clearly should not have to tolerate this. I just wonder if the Scottish Government might consider extending a full ban on mobile phones within schools.
First Minister. These are real-life problems in our schools, and that's why the Government has taken the action it's taken on mobile phone technology within our schools. But it highlights a deeper issue, which is about the importance of proactive education about the damage that can be done by the very activities that Russell Finlay has just put to me. And I'm reminded about the challenges I faced as Education Secretary and the controversy that surrounded the introduction of the Relationship, Sexual Health and Parenthood Education, which was vigorously resisted by many people. But I judged after very, very careful consideration that for all of the reasons that members of all sides have said, that education was required to confront the reality of what was readily available a click away from any child's mobile phone. And the importance of values-based education is fundamental in that respect. There has also been reference, aside from the education system, to the importance of criminal justice interventions. We've discussed the issues that Pam Gosal has raised, and Fiona Drury has expressed to me in a meeting I had with her just a couple of weeks ago the importance that she attaches to promoting the legislation on non-fatal strangulation, and the Government will consider those issues as part of its review of the criminal justice system in our country. And drawing my remarks to a close, Presiding Officer, I want to reflect on the actions that I think need to come from this debate. One of them is that we must follow up, men must follow up the challenge from Ben McPherson about being a better guy, about reflecting on our own behaviour. I am absolutely conscious at all moments as First Minister of the example I set in my behaviour, and it is uppermost in my consideration about how I act and conduct myself on these questions as First Minister. We have to strengthen the approach taken in education. I believe the values-based education and the relationship, sexual health and parenthood education will help us to try to perhaps win these arguments with young people, and particularly young boys in our society. But there is also the negative implications of social media in our society. Social media has got many, many strengths, but Parliament will be aware, as I am, of the curse that it can be in terms of what it is exposing our young people to. I've been reading a fascinating and incredibly disturbing book called The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, which goes through many of the implications of the social media activity on children and young people in our society. And it makes me seized of the importance, and I have corresponded with the United Kingdom Government on this question, and they are engaged on this question, about the need for much greater responsibility for the social media giants who are responsible for the purveying of some of the most unacceptable behaviours in our society. So the Scottish Government will be resolute in pursuing that particular issue. The final comment I want to make is that last Friday, a week past Friday, I had the pleasure, I'm not sure it's the pleasure, privilege, responsibility to launch the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence against women and girls in my home city of Perth. Powerfully led, powerfully put together by a magnificent team of people who annually concentrate on this issue. But I'm seized by Paul O'Kane's comment and also by Ben McPherson's comment that 16 days is welcome, but 365 days is even more welcome, where we change behaviour, change conduct, change attitudes. And I want to assure Parliament of the importance that I, as First Minister, and my government attach to accomplishing that objective.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on point of order. Pam Gossel.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, I'd like to apologise and correct the record. It's every 10 minutes a woman is killed by her partner or by a family member, not every 18 minutes, as I accidentally said in my speech. Also, my bill is the Prevention of Domestic Abuse Scotland Bill, not protection. It's been a long week, sorry.
Thank you, Ms Gossel. Perhaps not a point of order, but on the record now. Thank you. That concludes the debate on empowering young people's voices in tackling violence against women and girls, and it's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is consideration of motion 15752 in the name of Shona Robertson on a financial resolution for the Scottish Languages Bill. And I call on Shona Robertson to speak to and move the motion.
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The question on this motion will be put at decision time. The next item of business is consideration of Parliamentary Bureau Motion 15753 on establishment of a committee, and I ask Jamie Hepburn, on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. The question on this motion will be put at decision time, and there are 4 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first is that motion 15734, in the name of Graham Day, on support for the veterans and armed forces community in Scotland, be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. The next question is that motion 15735, in the name of CoCab Stewart, on empowering young people's voices in tackling violence against women and girls, be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. The next question is that motion 15752, in the name of Shona Robertson, on a financial resolution for the Scottish Languages Bill, be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. And the final question is that motion 15753, in the name of Jamie Hepburn, on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, on the establishment of a committee, be agreed. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed, and that concludes decision time, and I close this meeting.